Well, good morning, everyone. If this has worked out correctly, it should be a Tuesday. So good morning. I hope you're having a good Tuesday. For those of you who don't know who I am, I'm Neil Greig. I'm Director of Policy and Research at IAM RoadSmart, and I'm very pleased to be here taking part in Road Safety Great Britain's Festival of Road Safety, looking at improving the safety of motorcyclists, powered two-wheeler users. The presentation I'm going to deliver today should have been obviously delivered at the original conference. The full text of our report is available on our website, the details of which are coming up at the end of my presentation. I'm now going to, in the time-honoured fashion, share my screen and show you the PowerPoint that actually gives the detail of the presentation. Right, so today's presentation is about that really important question, particularly for those of us here at IAM RoadSmart. It's the $64,000 question. Does what we do actually deliver safer drivers and riders? And in this particular presentation, obviously, we're going to be looking at the motorcycling side of IAM RoadSmart. The motorcycling side of IAM RoadSmart is probably one of the most vibrant and growing parts of our activities. Our members are very engaged with this. They're very engaged with the local groups. Motorcycling with the IAM is very much a social activity. They like their ride outs, and you've probably seen a lot of our members gathering at the usual sort of motorcycling gathering points all over the country. And they do engage in a lot more activities at the group level at IAM than the drivers do. But obviously, when we're talking to government, when we're talking to an audience like yourselves, we want to be able to prove that what we actually do is making a contribution to road safety. And that's what we set out to do in this particular piece of research. We haven't been sitting still with advanced riding. We've updated our logbooks, we've updated our content. We now have a quality control system in place. So there's a lot of modernization going on. It's not just the same sort of course that we brought in 1987. We actually started in the 1950s, of course, with driving, but we only actually started doing advanced riding in 1987. But it's built around those core advanced motoring and riding skills of observation, anticipation, and planning. And of course, we do claim in all our sort of publicity materials, for example, that we make better riders and drivers. But of course, to make that claim, we should really have the research to back it up. And we do have some track record in motorcycling research. My department has done a number of reports over the years. I'll quickly go through some of those, just to show that pedigree, if you like. When I first started with IAM RoadSmart back in 2007, a long time ago, one of the first reports we did was on the design of crash barriers. You know, the fact that crash barriers are designed to contain cars, but not designed to contain motorcyclists, and in fact, actually actively injure motorcyclists who come off their bike and hit a crash barrier. I would hope that now, after all this time, we see a lot more motorcycle-friendly crash barriers, but there's still some work to be done on that. Back in 2012, we also did a report on a motorcycle simulator, actually done with Alex Steadman, who's taking part in this conference as well. And what that simulator ride showed was that a small sample of IAM riders versus non-IAM riders were able to negotiate the simulated route around Nottingham, as I recall, and they did it quicker. But they did it safer. They didn't break the speed limit, but by road positioning and by anticipation, they were able to actually complete the route safer and quicker. And that was a positive report, which we have used off and on over the years to promote our activities. We've also done a small report on cognitive behavior therapy, and that showed that if you give motorcyclists some coping strategies, it helps them to deal with the stresses and strains of motorcycling on our busy roads, particularly engaging with other road users. So that was very successful as well. And over the years, we've done a lot of customer research. The people who take our courses are very positive about our courses. Large numbers would recommend us to other people, and 61% have even told us that it's helped them to avoid a crash. So that's great news, and we use a lot of that again in our promotional materials. But of course, it's asking people who've already engaged with us what they think about IAM. So the view is that, of course, that they're bound to be positive because they've already engaged with us. What we need to do is compare IAM riders with non-IAM riders, and that's what this particular report is actually trying to do. And as I say, we felt we needed a bigger study because the previous studies we've done have either been of IAM members alone or a small number of non-IAM riders. So we commissioned Agilicis, who were back in the day called Road Safety Analysis, as you know, to do this particular piece of research for it. And it was to try and see if we could find out if IAM RoadSmart membership leads to safer attitudes and behaviours among motorcyclists. The key questions for the objectives for the research were the four that are laid out here. They were to see if IAM RoadSmart members scored lower on attitudinal scales. Now, attitude scales have been around for a long time, an accepted way of looking at road safety attitudes. So we felt that was an accepted and sort of scientifically preferred way of doing it. We also wanted to look at if they had the general attitudes to safety that IAM RoadSmart people had. And of course, the crunch question, number 3, you know, are IAM riders less likely to be involved in collisions? That's ultimately the sort of main indicator that most people use in road safety to see if what they've been doing has been successful, and often the most difficult one to answer, of course. And of course, we also asked, using another technique that's been widely adopted, we looked at the self-reported speed selection when IAM members and non-IAM members were shown pictures of hazards and non-hazards as well. So there was 4 different questions that the analysis set out if you'd like to answer. Before we even started, we ran into a bit of a challenge, which was trying to get 2 similar samples. Obviously, at IAM, we could access our IAM motorcycling members quite easily. We managed to get 719 of them very quickly to fill in a questionnaire. We then used that information to sort of further hone the questionnaire. But what we discovered, of course, and it probably won't be a surprise to those of you who've met some of our members, is that most IAM motorcycling members are middle-aged men. They tend to ride larger bikes, they tend to be high mileage users, and they tend to operate a number of different vehicles. So they're people who like to be out and about on the road. So we wanted to get a quota of non-bikers who are like that as well. And that proved a bit of a challenge. Ultimately, we had to use a technique which Agilicis supplied to us, which allowed us to correct a slightly smaller sample to build up those within that sample that matched the IAM sample. So overall, the samples were as evenly matched as possible. And of course, we got well over 1,200, almost 1,300 as a total sample, which is a good sample size to be working with. So the first of those questions was about attitudes and behavior. And again, I think most of you should be familiar with attitude scales, attitude surveys. And they basically look at the way people react to questions about road safety issues. Now, the figures you're seeing here on this particular table are agreement scores. So these are people who agreed with these particular statements on the left-hand side of the table. And what we found there was that broadly, attitudes were similar. As you'd expect, the more sort of difficult road safety statements, most people tended to either disagree or agree with. But what we found, for example, was that, and this was good news for us, areas where about awareness, about anticipation, the skills that they've been taught as IAM tended to come out with more agreement from the IAM members. So it looked as if some of the things we've been teaching them are getting through. They tended to have stronger attitudes against things like drinking and driving, for example, but they seem to have better scores or agreement about, for example, awareness of other drivers not being able to see them, judging the speed of other vehicles, that kind of thing. So overall, on this first set of questions, it was looking pretty positive, and it was also reflecting what we think we're teaching our IAM RoadSmart members as well. On these second set of selected ones I put here, we're starting to pick out some of the trends where there are differences. So questions about enforcement levels, for example, IAM members are much more likely to feel that there's not enough police out there compared to normal riders. They're also much more likely to be involved in their local community. So if you look, for example, at some of the points in the middle of that table, it is important to give something back to society through community involvement. IAM members much more likely to be in agreement with that, much more likely to be involved in other charity work, for example, as well. And the one above, they were less likely to agree that there's no need for unwritten rules in society, such as opening doors for ladies. I did have to argue quite strongly with some of my colleagues to keep that in, thanks to Agilicis, who felt it was a good indicator of attitudes to general unwritten rules in society. I mean, opening doors for ladies, what's that got to do with motorcycling? But it shows a more general approach to your involvement with the community. So overall, this particular set of questions did seem to show positive attitudes and behaviours to road safety by IAM RoadSmart members. And I can summarise that here by picking out again some of the key things: stronger attitudes against alcohol consumption, against drinking and riding, and overall, things were pretty close, but we were quite positive on things where they were engaging at lower speed limits in urban areas. Unfortunately, there was a tendency for IAM members to say that they were more likely to undertake on the inside, but of course some people call that filtering and see that as good behaviour. But the biggest differences overall were definitely in general attitudes to society and community involvement, and the views on road policing. That's where we saw the biggest differences. So we then moved on to self-reported collision involvement. And I think the key point to make at the start here, which is made in the first paragraph there, is that the vast majority of the people taking part in this survey had not had a collision at all. They'd not had an injury collision, and they'd not even had a non-injury collision, a non-damage collision. So a damage-only collision, sorry. So basically, we're looking at a small 10–20% of the sample who are then filling out the rest of the questions about the sort of collisions that they've had. But we did find from that smaller group of people who had collisions that the non-IAM members had a higher number of damage-only collisions in particular than our IAM members. But the numbers were small overall, and wasn't a particularly strong result, but it was definitely a difference there. The biggest difference came when we corrected IAM versus non-IAM for annual mileage. As I mentioned at the start, IAM people tend to use their bikes and cars a lot more than out there. There's a lot more exposure. And as many people will tell you, the more exposure you have out on the roads, the more likely you are to be involved in a collision. So we felt we had to correct for that. And the Ulysses did a very clever piece of analysis there. And what they found was that if you look at the miles that have to be ridden before an IAM member has a collision, that's over 15,000 miles a year. But a non-IAM member only has to ride 9,400 miles a year before they have a collision. So, overall, they're out there a lot more, but they're having less collisions per mile ridden, which obviously is a good indicator that there's something, again, positive going on there by being an IAM member. Again, we looked at some of the circumstances of those self-reported collisions. The bottom one probably won't be a surprise to many of you who've met some of our middle-aged IAM members with bigger bikes. They're much more likely to drop their bikes. So a lot of the collision, the damage-only incidents were just things like dropping the bike. Some of the larger sort of bar charts there, again, the darker color at the top is the non-IAM, the lighter blue underneath is the IAM. IAM people were less likely to lose control on a slippery surface. That's good news. And they were better coping with right turn crashes, but there was some issues around loss of control of bend, and also where no other vehicles were involved. So it wasn't a completely positive picture, but again, starting to see some trends coming out of there. Some that you might expect, such as dropping the bike, others where it's not quite so clear that what we're teaching them has led to those collisions. But again, you have to remember that was a very small part of that overall sample had actually had a collision. And the final part of the analysis was another TRL sourced approach, which is to show people pictures of road scenes, some with hazards, some without hazards, control ones and hazard ones, and ask them to sort of guess the speed they think they should be, in this case, riding at. It's been used for young drivers and other kinds of drivers in the past. So again, a large number of pictures, a large number of data gathered from the various the two quotas, the non-IAM and the IAM. And what we found here was, again, there was a difference. And the difference was that IAM people chose higher speeds. Now, that could be seen as a negative thing, or it could be seen as the fact that they are confident in their skills and feel that they can deal with the higher speeds. The good news was consistently between both groups, they recognized which were the non-hazard scenes and which were the hazard scenes and reduced their speeds. So that was good. That was showing some recognition there. But a slight element of sort of question coming in there, why is it that IAM RoadSmart members seem to be choosing higher speeds when shown control and hazard scenes? Is it about confidence? You know, is it overconfidence? You know, again, probably needs a bit more research to answer that question finally. So overall, what did we come to? I think we came to a conclusion that overall things were pretty positive. IAM members were likely to have more positive attitudes to riding in general, particularly to collision risk and problems. They were less hostile to the road users, and they had overall a lower collision involvement rate per mile ridden than non-IAM users. But they were perhaps more likely to select some higher speeds, and there were one or two behaviours in amongst those attitude and behaviour measures that might be called into question. But overall, the biggest difference was that they were much more likely to be involved in the community, much more likely to support the police, and much more likely to have these positive views of society in general. The biggest problem with that, of course, is that something that we have instilled in them at IAM RoadSmart, or did they have that within them when they joined us? Are we attracting people who already have positive attitudes to community involvement, to the police? Many of whom are ex-police officers, sometimes with IAM as well. Are they the ones who come forward? How do we expand our reach to get to these other people who have these other attitudes that we can then change? As I put at the bottom there, sort of rather tongue-in-cheek, maybe our claim should be that we make confident but faster riders, and that could be seen as a positive or a negative thing. I think among some groups it's seen as quite a positive thing. But as I say, overall, we felt this was a positive report. It's available on our website. We issued a press release about it back at the tail end of last year, and it was positively received by our members, and we do use its conclusions to help promote the work that we do in attracting motorcyclists to join the IAM. But it left a lot of unanswered questions, and my final slide here is basically sort of confirming that. You know, how do we then answer that question? We've tried lots of different ways of answering the question. Do we need a bigger study, a bigger sample? Would that solve the problem? Would it still unearth this issue of the fact that people who join us are more likely to be positive about road safety? Do we need a random control study? Do we need to get hold of people before they join us, see what kind of rider they were, assess them during their riding training, and then assess them after they've passed the advanced test and look at that progress, if you like? And perhaps the best way to look at that in the future might be to look at some sort of telematics. We've had a black box telematics study ongoing with some of our car members, and that has shown quite simply that the IAM drivers are much more likely to brake well, not to speed, they anticipate problems. The black box shows that they were actually better drivers. So I'm looking for something like that for motorcyclists. So if anyone out there has a black box that can replicate the sort of detail that we have on black boxes for cars, then we'd be quite interested to talk to you about doing a study like that in the future. So as I say here, the search for the answer goes on. We think overall, if you look at the surveys of the people who've engaged with us, if you look at this survey, there's a lot of positives there. We think advanced riding is a positive contribution to road safety. We think we've proved that, but we'll always want to make that clearer and then come up with that really a really clear answer to that question that we do provide safer riders and drivers. As I say, you can see the full study on our website, iamroadsmart.com, and I'm happy to take any questions on the chat or later, and you know how to get in touch with me, and if not, you can ask the organisers. Thank you for your attention, and I hope you enjoy the rest of the Road Safety Great Britain Festival of Road Safety. Thank you.